Okay, this is going to be a longer video, but I think it'll be worthwhile for you. I still see a lot of questions about how to set up single sign-on for Access Gateway Enterprise Edition with Web Interface Server. So I just want to take a little bit of time here to go over how you can configure that real quickly. And what I've got is a domain controller or an LDAP server configured at this address. So some of the things you're going to need an LDAP server, which in most cases will be a domain controller. You'll need an LDAP bind account. This is just an account that will let you bind to Active Directory for the purposes of authenticating your users. And then I've just put down a couple of other things that I want to cover during the lab. So one of them, the XML broker, the actual URL, which is vpn.bgc.com for bridgegapconsulting.com. And then of course I want to talk about what a SAM account name and what a user principal name is. These are going to be important to know depending on how your organization likes to log in. So with that, the first thing I want to do is let's just go over to our Access Gateway node on our Netscaler, and we're going to take a look at an existing VIP that we've set up. So a lot of you should be pretty familiar with this. In a lot of cases, authentication is off and it occurs at the web interface server. Now we're going to talk about how to do the authentication on the actual Netscaler. So I'm going to take and unbind this local policy because I don't want to do local authentication. I want to authenticate to my Active Directory domain. And then you should already know how to do all of this. So here's your how to set up a ticketing and all of that stuff. So and then a session policy. So let's take a look here. The way I like to do it, I know that there are wizards. I'm just not a big fan of a lot of the wizards that are out there. That I'm sure they all work fine, but I'm going to cover how to do it manually. So I'm going to take a look at my session policy here, and basically this shouldn't have anything to do with authentication, but I just want to make sure you're familiar with this. Here you're going to basically leave these alone because we have ICA proxy turned on. So you want to turn on ICA proxy. You want to put the URL in to your web interface, which is CAG Lab is the actual web interface instance we're going to create. For the purposes of the lab, note that this is HTTP. In production, you'll want that to be HTTPS with the exact same cert that you're using for the VPN. In this case, because it's a lab, I've left it as just HTTP. I would not recommend that for production. So that is a typical session policy, and that has been bound to the actual VIP. And I'll just show you that real quick. Alright, so this really doesn't have anything to do with authentication. I want to talk about authentication and how to set that up. So I brought up earlier that we had an LDAP server located at 192.168.1.25, and we had an LDAP bind account. So I'm going to go ahead and set up an authentication policy for LDAP. So I'm going to just call this LDAP. And it is going to use LDAP, and I'm going to set a standard true value here. And the next one, and the most important one, is I'm going to configure the server. Okay, and I'm going to call this LDAP-SAM, okay, for SAM account name. And the reason I tell you that is that my users log on with both. They log on with their regular user account and they log in with their UPN, and they've gotten used to that. I don't want to generate a number of help desk calls for failed logins. So I'm going to configure both policies. So coming back to the Netscaler, this is for the SAM account name. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to type in the IP address of my domain controller here, which is 192.168.1.25, And then let's take some time, and my domain controller is acting up a little, but if you notice here, my domain is bgc.com, and we're going to represent that as a distinguished name. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to say the users are located in DC equals BGC, comma, DC equals com. And then the bind DN is going to be, let's see, VPN bind at bgc.com. So VPN bind at bgc.com. And again, I know this says administrator bind DN. In fact, it does not need to be a domain admin. And I'm going to enter the password in. And then some really smart person at Citrix put this retrieve attributes in. And that lets you test your attributes. So I've set this up so that I could log in with my SAM account name. And again, my SAM account name is represented here. It is not the login that has the @bgc.com. So now that that's set up, it is using port 389. I'll bring this up real quick. In production, that will need to be port 636, and you will want to use encryption on that, at least SSL. If you do not, your credentials will be passed in clear text. And if an auditor finds it, you're going to look really dumb. So I have looked at it in Wireshark. There will be your password sitting there in clear text. So please, outside of the lab and in production, it is imperative that you use encryption here and you encrypt those credentials. For now, we're going to leave it alone, and we're just going to run it at 389. For your own production environments, make sure that you're using secure LDAP or LDAP-S, and that should be port 636. At any rate, now that this has been created, I'm ready to allow LDAP authentication. But first I have to configure the web interface server. So I'm going to go over to my web interface server, and what we want to remember from our session policy is that we are using Citrix/CAG Lab as the website. So I'm going to come to my web interface server, and if you look here, we have this already set up. I've set up my server farms. This should all be familiar for you already, but the key thing you want to remember, two key things. The access method is here, okay? It needs to authenticate back. It needs to hand the authentication token back to the access gateway appliance. So in here, if you look, we are using https://vpn.bgc.com, and then it gives you the rest of the URI stem that you're going to need to write in. A good way to test this is to actually open up Internet Explorer and make sure that you can get to that actual IP address. Because if you cannot, then your authentication is going to fail. So if I come here, and if you look, you'll see I'm able to open this up. That's a good sign. That means that the web interface server can find its way to the authentication URL that's on the Access Gateway Enterprise. Another thing to keep in mind, if this is in the DMZ, or if you have a duplicate record internally, such say it was citrix.bgc.com, I would have to make a host file entry to make sure that it went to the actual VPN interface. So it's imperative that the web interface server be able to find its way to that VIP that you've created. If it cannot find its way back, it will not be able to authenticate. So that is very important to remember. So those have to match up. If you don't have a DNS record pointing to its location in the DMZ, you can create one, or you can make a host file entry on all of your web interface servers. There shouldn't be a lot of them. so that it can find its way back to the authentication URL. If this isn't configured, it won't work. The other important step on the web interface server is to make sure that it is set to gateway direct. This should already be familiar to you if you've set up the gateway, even if you're authenticating on the web interface server. And here is your secure gateway address, and then you will want to use the exact same ticket authority as you've instantiated on the access gateway under the published applications node on the VIP. So if you look here, this is 192.168.1.205. If I go back to my VIP, this should also be the same. And if you set this up without authentication on the access gateway, you should already be familiar with this. So that's important to make sure that these are exactly the same. So now that that is completed, the other important part to remember, I didn't take it through the entire, so I'll walk through this. When you set this up, okay, you will want to make sure that you've put authentication occurs at the access gateway. And then here, okay. Most of you are already familiar with how to set up the site once it's completed, so I'm not going to go through that once this is done creating, but basically you'll set up your XML brokers. Also, the wizard that this takes you through does not set it to gateway direct. You'll have to do that afterward. So while that's baking, because we already have a site that's set up for us. So that's the walkthrough on how to set up the initial site, and then you can set up your server farms here. If you remember, I set up my XML brokers earlier, and then again out of the gate it does not set up gateway direct, so you need to go ahead and set that. And add your ticketing server. And now these should be configured almost identically. So what's going to happen, important thing to remember, what's going to happen is you're going to authenticate to the Access Gateway Enterprise Edition appliance. It's going to pass your credentials to the domain controller, and then once it gets to the web interface is going to pass that access token back to the CAG at this address here. Once that happens, it'll determine whether or not you can start a session with it. So now that we have this set up, I'm going to go ahead and try to log in. Okay, and that's not working. It's a live lab, so let's take a look at why that's not working. Let's take a look here, and I bet I forgot something. So the authentication policies always work better when you actually bind them to the VIP, so you get to see a official screw up here on one of my videos. So you need to bind the authentication policy to the VIP. Now if I was also going to use a secure ID, I would add a secondary one. For this lab I'm not doing that. So I'm going to bind the LDAP policy to the actual VIP, and now when I log in, I am able to authenticate, and there's my little XenAPP 6 box. Now, I mentioned earlier that I have a couple of different methods of authenticating for my users. Okay, let's go back to authentication. So this was using the SAM account name, but again, a lot of my users, I would say over half of them, log in using the UPN. Now when I come over here and I try to log in with the UPN, well, it doesn't work. And I'm calling the help desk, and the help desk is getting flooded with calls, and then I'm getting a call from an angry help desk manager. So I want to be able to accommodate both methods. So I'm going to create a second authentication policy. And authentication type will be LDAP. And I'm going to make a new server. Okay, actually the best way to do this to save me a lot of time is I'll create the server first. And if I click this and just hit add, it will pre-fill in everything for me, and I will put user principal name here. And I will name this LDAP-UPN. And I will create it. So now I have two servers, one for accommodating SAM account name and one for accommodating UPN. So now I'll create a new policy called LDAP-auth-UPN, and I will select the UPN and create. And now what I forgot the last time, I will go and bind it to this URL, to this VPN VIP. So now, when I open it up, so let me just check my time. Yeah, another long lab, sorry. jsmith@bgc.com, and I'm able to log in. And likewise, my SAM account name also logged in. So now I'm able to accommodate both methods of authentication without generating a whole bunch of calls. How we got there is a long story, but needless to say, I have to accommodate both. So I was going to go over LDAP a little more, but I'm creeping up on 20 minutes. But basically, well, let me look at it real quick here. What you want to remember is that I'm searching for users from the top of the domain. This can, in an enterprise of 100,000 users, create excessively long logon times while the LDAP server searches. In fact, you could exceed your TTL. So keep in mind, you can discriminate and go down even a little further, you know, by OU equals accounting, and then, or you can set up your LDAP policies to try to speed things up by drilling down into some of the users. Or if your organization has collated the users strategically into different OUs, just keep in mind the higher up you go in the LDAP infrastructure, the longer it's going to take for your users to authenticate. So those are some of the things that you're going to have to remember as you log users in and as you leverage LDAP as a solution on your Netscaler. Another thing you can do too that I'll recommend, only because I've had a domain controller fail. Basically, if you look at that, we set up a domain and authentication policy to a single server IP. So essentially, if this domain controller fails, which, let's face it, there are two kinds of systems, failed and failing. If this domain controller fails, I'm in a lot of trouble. One of the strategies you can do is actually create a VIP and instantiate 10 or 12 domain controllers that you'll be able to leverage. So if you come here, you'd set up TCP 192.168.1.2, and I'm going to say port 389 for the purposes of this. And basically you could go in here, domain controller 1, and oops. And basically you could use this as your authentication server instead of a single domain controller, which would represent a single point of failure. So anyway, you saw TipCam warn me, so I'm going to just end it because this is like the longest UTip you ever. Anyway, that is basically single sign-on through the AGEE integrated with web interface server. Hope this helps you guys, and have a great day. Thanks for watching, and thanks for that 20 minutes and 50 seconds you'll never get back. See ya.